is our third session this afternoon. And for those of you that have been here for all three, you'll be able to do these housekeeping announcements as well as I can by the end of the afternoon. But for those that are new, please know that you're welcome here and we're grateful that you're here. My name is Rebecca Southerns and it's my privilege to be walking us through this conversation this afternoon. I want to give you a sense of the overall shape of these conversations today so that you'll know where to look for more information and how else to get involved. As I mentioned, we're on number 3 of multiple sessions today that started at 1 o'clock. And people can kind of choose their own adventure. For those that were here at 1 and again at 6:30, there's an overview of the Clare Maltby Draft Secondary Plan. Then at 2 o'clock, we were discussing water and wastewater. And this conversation, as you can see from the slide in front of you, is about environment and stormwater management in Clare Maltby. We're going to take a break around the dinner hour from about 3:45 till 6:30. And then starting at 6:30, in addition to that overview again, we'll be looking at land use and parks planning. And then at 8 o'clock tonight, we'll be looking at mobility. So if you're interested in any or all of those topics, you're very welcome to join us at those times. I want to let you know that this feedback is being collected as part of stakeholder engagement and public input on the Clare Maltby Secondary Plan, as well as to satisfy the requirements of the Environmental Assessment Act. Please note that the event will be recorded and the recording may be shared on the city's website and social media channels. Any comments or questions submitted during the event may be published or shared and will be used to reflect overall feedback and help inform policy. We are grateful for your involvement. We know that there are many other things competing for your attention and are grateful that you're here. I want to also acknowledge our gratitude for the territory on which we are gathered. We're reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a city, we have a responsibility for stewardship of this land on which we now live and work. And today we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations of the Anishinaabe people and are grateful to be gathering on this land today. So thank you for acknowledging that this traditional territory belongs to them. It's really important for us to be mindful of this, particularly during such a horrific and difficult week that we've had in terms of our Indigenous current and history. I want to acknowledge the folks that are here also on the panel that will be answering your questions today and making presentations. What our plan is for the overall time that we have together for the next 45 minutes is that for about the first half, we'll be hearing from a consulting crew that knows about environmental and stormwater work when it comes to Clare Maltby. Then in the second part, we'll be answering your questions clustered thematically. We may not answer each one individually in this setting, but please know that this is the start of something longer. For about the next 6 or 7 weeks, we will have a virtual Clare Maltby Town Hall available on Have Your Say Guelph. So every question that's asked today, whether we answer it in this forum or not, will be posted there and answered fully. So questions that are in the chat that are kind of quick and easy answers, our staff are here to do that. And then ones that require a bit more background or explanation will be answered as well on Have Your Say. And then we'll group some of those themes together and have a conversation in the second half of today's session to the extent that we're able. There will be some other opportunities for you to engage as well if you'd like to do that. So if you'd like to attend office hours with city staff to speak about more specific concerns or questions you might have about Clare Maltby, we will be setting that up. And also there will be some small group targeted audience specific kinds of groups happening. So multiple opportunities for input, all leading up to the statutory public meeting, which will happen sometime this fall. Exactly when that will be is a bit dependent on the nature and quantity of input we get between now and then. I want to note a couple of other things for you that have to do with WebEx mechanics. One is that you may find that some of the slides contain maps and things that are hard to read because of the level of detail they contain. You can zoom in. On the left-hand side of your viewing panel, you will see a zoom in and out magnifying glass. So you can adjust your own view of what you're looking at so that you can zoom in and out to see those features. The other thing I want to be clear about is that in WebEx, when you are putting your questions in the chat, please make sure they are going to everyone. There's a drop-down menu where you can choose who receives your messages. And as we learned in the previous session, when it says all attendees, that means all the members of the public that are here. But unfortunately, none of the panelists are considered attendees. So we were not seeing all of the questions right away. So we need you to put your questions to everyone, if you don't mind. And that way the panelists can all see them and all of the other attendees in the virtual room can see them also. Let me introduce our panelists to you today. We have a variety of folks here from the City of Guelph, including Mary Angelo, who's the Manager of Development and Environmental Engineering. We have the Manager of Policy Planning and Urban Design at the City of Guelph. We've got Stacey Laughlin, who's a Senior Policy Planner with the city. Colleen Gammy is an infrastructure planning engineer. Madeline Gibson is a policy planner. Leah Leffler is here as an environmental planner. And Andrew Sandor is here as a planning clerk and is also doing tech support for us today. So we really appreciate that solid crew from the city who will be helping with this conversation. My name, as I said, is Rebecca Southerns. My company is called Sage Solutions, and my colleague Sydney Orlander is here as well. We do strategy and stakeholder engagement facilitation. From the consulting crew, we have Elizabeth Hausen, who is here from MSH. She's the planning lead for the consulting team. With her is Ron Scheckenberger. Ron's with Wood Canada, and he is the MESP lead for the consulting team, so the Master Environmental Plan. Margot Ersick is here from Beacon Environmental. Darren Abbey is here from Matrix Solutions, and Steve Chips also from Wood. So we are really grateful for the great turnout of the folks who can speak to us with great expertise around stormwater and environmental management. And I think that might be all of the things on my list. I hope I haven't missed anything critical, but I am looking forward to learning more about environmental and stormwater management in this part of our city. So with that, I'll turn it over to the team to make that presentation, and we'll remind you, please address your questions to everyone and put them in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to them. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. My name is Ron Scheckenberger, and as noted, I'm with Wood Canada, and I've been the lead on the two fundamental studies that have been guiding both the environmental management and ultimately the servicing of the proposed Clare Maltby lands. I'm going to be providing a brief introduction, and then I'm going to be turning it over to Margot Ersick, who's going to provide an overview of the natural heritage, and then Darren Abbey, who's going to do the same for groundwater, and then I'll close it off with surface water and then conclusions. There's a lot of slides, but I'm sure the content can be most helpful for you to understand the complexities of this study area. Next slide. So this map basically shows the inner area, right in the very smallest geometry being the Clare Maltby study area. But it needs to be acknowledged that Clare Maltby is part of something bigger, and it's part of the watersheds that basically are around it, and it ultimately feeds to it. Very unique lands in that they're in the headwaters of basically two primary systems and a third. So there's the Hanlon, the Torrance, and the Mill, with direct discharge to the Hanlon and the Mill. So in studying this area, it's been important to not consider just the lands of Clare Maltby, but also those lands that are surrounding it. Next slide. So the Comprehensive Environmental Impact Study, it's a fancy name, but this study itself has looked in high level of detail to the environmental resources across the landscape, studied them on the basis of field work, collecting detailed contemporary data, and then using that data to characterize the systems for what then becomes an impact assessment. And from this then develops guidance to implementation and monitoring, and that work then feeds directly into the Master Environmental Servicing Plan. Next slide. So this diagram, if you were part of the earlier presentations, it really shows the interrelationship between all the different technical studies that ultimately feed into the secondary plan in the middle. So to the right, you have the Comprehensive Environmental Impact Study that really provides that environmental template and the underpinning. And then on the left, in the gray tones, you see all the different services. And those services are required to provide fully functioning urban lands. Next slide. So these slides, again, represent different levels of detail, the urban land uses that are being proposed within the Clare Maltby lands, and they show the predominance of residential as well as the two different forms of residential, higher density and lower density, and then the extensive network of natural systems that exist across the landscape, and the majority of which are being proposed to be retained on the landscape and in fact enhanced. Next slide. So this is the introduction then to the natural heritage system. So this shows the current functioning context of the proposed natural heritage system. And with that, I will turn it over to Marga Orsic to provide you with further detail. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Ron. So I am here today to talk to you about natural heritage. Next slide, please. And what I like to do is I'm going to zoom us way out for a couple of slides, and then we'll get back down to the study area. So what you're seeing here on your left is the Periscalt Moraine. It extends approximately from Caledon all the way down into Norfolk County, actually. The image on the right-hand side is a little bit closer, so you can see south of Guelph. So the Paris Moraine, so that's the portion of the moraine that runs through the city, is really the predominant landform feature, and it's very well defined in the south end. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this again shows the hummocky topography. In the gray, you can see that bumpy bit that's sitting south of the outwash plain. That again is our study area on the left side. Then in the right side, you can see some of the geology that informs it. So we have this hummocky topography, and then we also have this very well-drained soil. So it's a combination of predominantly Wentworth tills and gravels. And as a result of that topography, these are headwaters, and these are also areas where we do not really have a defined watercourse, as you would often see in an urban natural heritage system. In many natural heritage systems, the watercourses are the backbone. In this case, it's the morainal topography and the pockets of wetlands that are sustained within it. Next slide, please. So here again, I know you've seen this one already, but I just wanted to point out on this one that the study area is split between watersheds. So the Hanlon Creek watershed to the north and Mill Creek watershed to the south. Both of them are quite sizable watersheds. And again, the secondary plan area is in the headwaters of both of those areas. Next slide, please. So here we are. This is our secondary plan area, and I wanted to point out that even at the outset of this study, we weren't starting from scratch. There was already a very well-defined natural heritage system that had been based on work that was done basically starting in about 2004 and completing in around 2009, 2010. And so we already had quite a bit of information to draw on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, I want to draw your attention back to landform. I know this is getting a bit tiresome now. So as part of the natural heritage system identification and designation, one of the biggest pieces and components of that was portions of the Paris Moraine running through the south end of the city, which were identified as significant and really formed the backbone of the natural heritage system. And I also wanted to mention that as part of this process, this significant landform mapping has actually been unaltered. So there was no need to refine it. It's remained in place, and it is being carried forward as part of the natural heritage system that we're currently looking at for the Clare Maltby study area. Next slide, please. So there was already an NHS identified. What did we do? Well, over time, those of you who are familiar with environmental policies, they tend to change. So what we did is we re-examined the features that had been identified in the context of the current applicable environmental policies and regulations, of which there are a number, and I won't get into them right now. Also took a very integrated approach to our analysis. So we worked very closely with the Wood team, who looked at surface water, and Matrix team, who looked at groundwater, to try and make sure we had a really good understanding of how groundwater and surface water was supporting the natural systems in this area. And so there was targeted monitoring, both related to surface and groundwater, that took place over several years. as well as scoped ecological monitoring, which included a range of activities such as some targeted breeding bird surveys, updates to vegetation communities, as well as looking at wildlife movement across the area. So in terms of the assessment of impacts that took place was based on the existing conditions that were assessed, and then the final phases, there was an assessment of impacts associated with different community structure options that were explored through the secondary plan process, and then the establishment of an integrated management and monitoring framework, which I will touch on again at the end of my slides. Next slide, please. So what natural heritage systems did we look at? Components did we look at? We looked at surface water features and fish habitat, significant wetlands and other wetlands, significant woodlands, and in the city of Guelph, there is a category called cultural woodlands, significant wildlife habitat, as I've mentioned, significant landform, as well as habitat for provincially and locally significant species, and the ecological linkages connecting those various components together. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through a few slides now, again, very quickly, and these will be posted, and so you're welcome to look at these. They're also available in the reports, just showing the different components. And when we develop natural heritage systems, it's very much a layering process where we're looking at the different combinations of features, and then ultimately the system is made up of all the various layers. So what you're looking at here is the significant wetlands, which are in the dark blue, and the other wetlands, which are in the brighter blue, with their respective minimum buffers in accordance with the current official plan policies. Next slide, please. So this slide looks at the headwater drainage features. So as I mentioned, we don't really have any watercourses per se within the secondary plan area, but we do have some drainage features that run between some of the wetlands and within some of the wetlands that you can see here. Some of them were assessed on site, some of them were assessed remotely. And so these have been flagged as something that needs to be looked at when site-specific development occurs on these particular parcels. Next slide, please. Fish habitat was another consideration. So yes, we did not have watercourses, but some of the ponds do hold fish. We collected this information from a variety of sources. And we also looked at fish habitat in some of the what we call the secondary study area. So again, both in Hanlon Creek watershed and down in the mill. And one of the most important findings that came out of our work is that these headwaters do help support cool and cold water streams, respectively, in Hanlon and in Mill Creek. So Hanlon to the north of the study area and Mill Creek to the south. Next slide, please. This is a map of the woodlands that are protected through the natural heritage system. So the dark areas are the significant woodlands, and then the lighter areas are what are called the cultural woodlands, where there may be more flexibility through the planning process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this colorful map is significant wildlife habitat. This is a fairly complicated component of the natural heritage system. It's identified through in accordance with provincial policies and guidelines. But basically what it does is it captures some of the specialized or unique habitats in various natural heritage systems. So for the most part, these overlap with existing wetlands, woodlands, other features. In a few cases, they may not. So here you can see, for example, in the city of Guelph, there are turtle habitats, frog habitats that are considered significant, etc. So that is what's been flagged here. Next slide, please. So this is the ecological linkage mapping, and this one, you might note, is a little bit more zoomed out so that you can see context. And so what this brings together is all of the various layers and ensuring that there's connectivity between them. So the blue is, again, the wetlands. The green is the other stuff, so the significant landform, the significant woodlands, and then the brown areas that you can see in a few locations, those are linkages that are identified to sort of fill gaps where they exist to ensure that there's connectivity between the different components. We also considered connectivity to natural areas outside of the secondary plan area. And you can see that there are some connections that have been identified and confirmed going to natural heritage south of the city, to the east, and to the west, as well as to the north. Next slide, please. So quickly, what did we find? We found lots of stuff. 467 plant species, 112 bird species, 10 species of amphibians, 7 species of reptiles. So again, including several species that are considered provincially endangered, and species at risk as well. Next slide. So here we are. This is what it all amounts to, the refined natural heritage system. And this refined natural heritage system was used throughout the process as really the base constraint against which the various land uses were identified and applied. Next slide, please. So one of the things that happened through this process is a little bit unusual. Often when we refine a natural heritage system, it means it shrinks as a result of site-specific studies, but in this case, it did not. So if we look at, again, the different components and the totals for the refined natural heritage system, it actually increased slightly. So the 2014 NHS, as it was approved, was about 42% of the Clare Maltby secondary plan area. The final system came to just over 45% of that area. So one thing that we had comments previously about is why are there no restoration areas identified? And really, we can speak to this again in a bit more detail, but the primary reason is that because of the nature of the way that restoration areas are defined in the official plan, these are a component that really makes more sense to identify through the planning process. Once it is confirmed where the development is going to sit and where the opportunities are for restoration, there are also going to be a variety of naturalization opportunities through buffers and linkages and other features. Next slide, please. So now I have, after all those pictures, two jammed packed with text, but here we go. These are the last two. So based on all that information, what did we end up recommending to avoid and to minimize impacts going forward? So there's basically two sides to this. It was in part through the design of the process. So things that were recommended through the secondary plan, in and of themselves, the work was done iteratively to avoid and minimize impacts to the natural heritage system. So key examples of this are the fact that all the known components of the natural heritage system are identified as exclusive land use designations, including the applicable buffers. So those are protected and identified right off the bat. There will be refinements to those through the planning process, but it starts from a position of protection. Keeping arterial roads from crossing significant wetlands and significant woodlands. So obviously any planning area needs roads. That connectivity is also important for a whole variety of reasons, both for active transportation and more general transportation needs. But these crossings were minimized and they were put in a less ecologically sensitive location to the greatest extent possible through the iterative work that was done through this process. One example of this is also building on the wildlife crossing infrastructure. So already in the South End, there are a number of locations where there have been, for example, culverts put in to accommodate salamander and frog and amphibian movement and other wildlife. And so part of the work that's been done is identifying locations where, as part of future development, additional crossings could be identified. The moraine ribbon, which some of you who if you've been in previous sessions might have heard about already. So this is basically a 10 to 15 meter wide strip adjacent to many parts of the natural heritage system that keeps trails largely outside of the natural heritage system, provides connectivity and provides access to it. And then another key example is placement of stormwater capture areas again, and Ron will be speaking to those as well. But just in terms of their locations, so that they provide what we call supplemental buffering to the natural heritage system for more intensive land uses. Next slide, please. So last one. So in addition to all those efforts, it's understood that as part of development of these areas, there are going to be some unavoidable impacts that need to be managed. And again, there's a range of mechanisms that are identified in the documents that have been developed and in the planning direction. But some key examples include, again, protection of the features in accordance with the official plan policies moving forward. Ecologically sensitive site design. So for example, there are policies that provide direction to integration of significant landform in a way that's sensitive to minimize grading, for example, restoration of disturbed topography, for example. Incorporating locally appropriate water management. And again, I'm not going to speak to that because Darren and Ron will speak to that in much more detail. Maintaining and enhancing connectivity. So again, as I've already mentioned, maintaining the linkages that have been identified and naturalizing those linkages going forward, as well as making sure there's connectivity through the roads, through, for example, amphibian and reptile culverts. And then ongoing management and targeted monitoring. So the city has a number of programs that they are developing as well as programs in place. So examples of that include implementing and requiring fencing between public natural areas, tracking changes in vegetation and tree cover, as well as wildlife movement as part of ongoing monitoring. And with that, I will pass it on to Darren.
Okay, thanks, Margot. My name is Darren Abbey. I'm from Matrix Solutions, and I have the pleasure of presenting the groundwater component or the hydrogeology component of the Clare Maltby study. Next slide, please. Margot provided a good overview of the context for the study area within the Paris marine areas. So what I'll do is focus in on the groundwater system. So to understand more about how the groundwater system functions in the study area, in phase 1, we did some characterization work, and this included drilling 17 boreholes at 9 locations, and many of these were located near surface water features, Hall's Pond, Halligan's Pond, Newman's Pond, etc. And at many of these locations, we also drilled or installed some shallow drive point wells, which allowed us to evaluate the surface water groundwater interaction between the ponds and the groundwater system. Next slide, please. Obviously, we've talked about the study area being a recharge area, well-drained soils, and we know that that groundwater that precipitation that's entering the system is recharging groundwater. But where does that groundwater end up? So one of the things that we did was map out locations of groundwater discharge, and that was done by throughout a number of areas where we observed flowing streams in the headwater areas of Mill Creek to the south, Hanlon Creek shown in orange, sort of most of the study area, and to the north, Torrance Creek to the northeast, and the Speed River to the extreme northwest. And each of those yellow dots represents a location where we measured stream flow during drier periods when there hadn't been rainfall. And what that did is gave us an understanding of the volume of groundwater discharge in the area, and allowed us to start understanding how the secondary plan area may be contributing to those discharge areas. As Margot noted, there's very little surface water in the study area, and you'll notice that we only found one location where we could measure spot flows within the primary study area. Next slide, please. So if we look at the water level data that was collected at those wells, this is an example of a set of locations near Hall's Pond, and you'll see on the graph we have the water level elevation above sea level on the left, and the bottom of the graph shows time from 2016 through 2017. The plots, the two near the bottom, the deep monitoring well and the shallow monitoring well, show the water level over a few seasons and show that the water level in the groundwater flow system is highest in the spring, as you expect, and declines through the summer and into the fall. The water levels plotted higher up in the graph represent those shallow drive point piezometers around Hall's Pond and other ponds, and they show how the water level varies there, which looks quite different than the deeper system, which is buffered from those individual rainfall events. But what this shows is the elevation of the pond is above the elevation of the groundwater system, and this corroborates the idea that recharge is occurring in the Hall's Pond area. Next slide, please. With this information, these water levels that we've mapped, we're able to develop groundwater flow maps and understand which way groundwater is flowing from these recharge areas. And this shows that generally the study area is a groundwater high and groundwater flows radially towards the into the surrounding sub-watersheds. The black line is a cross section that we'll look at on the next slide. Next slide, please. Which is a schematic showing ground surface topography, the black line along the top, and it's the northwest corner of that line. So Clare Road is on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side is Halligan's Pond, which would be at the corner of Victoria and Maltby Road. And in the middle is Hall's Pond. The blue areas on ground surface represent many of the ponds that are interpreted to be perch features, so they're filled primarily by runoff from the system as opposed to groundwater recharge. But many of those ponds are shown from those shallow monitoring to be leaking water and providing some input to groundwater recharge to the water table, which is that continuous line you see from left to right on the model or on the figure. The blue arrows below the water table show schematically groundwater flow directions and show that primarily near the center of the study area, we're seeing mostly vertical flow. But as that vertical flow also moves laterally to the north into Hanlon Creek, into the shallow system, as well as south into Mill Creek. And that's where we observe those groundwater discharge features that we mapped. And there's also a component of flow that moves vertically into our bedrock aquifers. Next slide, please. So that was the phase 1 characterization. In phase 2, we built a numerical model to simulate everything that we understand about the existing conditions groundwater system. So it provides us with a tool where we can simulate different climate periods, we can change land use, and we can understand how that will impact our pond features, our groundwater flow directions, and groundwater discharge. It allows us to quantify the water balance at a monthly timescale. Next slide, please. And I'll skip to the next one again, just in the interest of time. So one of the outputs that we get from the model is a map of groundwater recharge. So this shows us the spatial variability of recharge within the study area, which varies in the higher areas from 400 to 500 millimeters per year to values less than 200 or 150 millimeters per year. Those higher areas are typically associated with the depressional areas we see in the study area. Next slide, please. This is also model output, and it shows where the model is simulating groundwater discharge conditions. And those are the red areas, and those tend to correspond with the headwaters of Mill Creek, Hanlon Creek, and others. And as you see, this also aligns with our observed conditions that most of that discharge is occurring outside of the study area. Next slide. So having characterized the groundwater flow system in phase 1 and built a model to represent existing conditions in phase 2, we now move to phase 3, where we complete the impact assessment. So we use that integrated model to represent future land use conditions, and that changes factors on the surface, such as the amount of vegetation and evapotranspiration, changes the amount of imperviousness, so how much water can be infiltrated through areas that may be paved now or have houses built on them. And it also allows us to represent different approaches to managing stormwater. So Margot touched on source control, where we're using low impact development methods to infiltrate water as close to the source as possible, or for the stormwater capture areas that are used to capture some of those large events in some of the areas. So we use the model to represent the initial community structure as well as the updated community structure, and we were able to assess impacts under each of those conditions and adjust our stormwater management approach to maintain recharge and groundwater system and other groundwater system functions. Next slide, please. And we'll skip to the next one as well. So out of iteration 1 and 2 of the land use, what we were able to demonstrate is that the water budgets for the secondary plan area and the primary study area, as well as the main ponds, including Halls and Newman and Halligan ponds, the water budgets were maintained. Groundwater flow directions were comparable to existing conditions, and discharge locations were also maintained. Recharge volumes to the water table and the bedrock aquifers were maintained, and I'll discuss more about that in a couple of slides. So we'll just move on to the next one if we could. one thing we did notice in iterations 1 and 2 is that Halls and Newman Pond, the water balance showed that there was potentially an increase in water level in both Halls and Newman's Pond following development. And we wanted to understand the significance of that increase. So if we go to the next slide. This is a graphic showing I would say the sort of the different environments that exist within a wetland, and it shows the winter and the variation in winter and summer water levels within the wetland, and how these influence the habitat that's available on the edge of the wetland and within the wetland. And what our concern was is if we were changing the water level of the wetland over time on average, how would that potentially impact the habitat that exists. So if you go to the next slide. We built a more detailed version of the model, so we call this iteration 3, where we better represented the conditions around Halls Pond in more detail, and it also coincided with an update to the land use where the community park was moved to the west of Halls Pond, and this reflects the final community structure. We also adjusted some of the stormwater capture areas that you see on the lower part of that slide to move them further away from the pond. Next slide. This graphic shows again our same cartoon of the wetland and its hydro period, and the plot on the left-hand side shows the average monthly water level for existing conditions in orange and future conditions in blue under iteration 3, and shows that there would be a small increase in the average water level of about 5 centimeters. So this was smaller than what we observed with the coarser model. So the refinements showed us that those impacts are likely to be less, with having more detail represented. But we were also able to look at the frequency with which the different areas would be ponded or dry. And that's what the graphic or the plot on the bottom right corner shows, where existing conditions line plotted in blue is overlain almost exactly by the future conditions, showing the frequency with which different areas would be ponded, showing us that the hydro period would be maintained. Next slide. So our final conclusion from iteration 3 was that the groundwater recharge and discharge function was maintained. Water budgets for the primary and secondary study areas, as well as the major pond wetland features, Halls, Newman's, and Halligan's Pond, was maintained. And groundwater flow directions and discharge locations were maintained, and recharge to the water table and bedrock aquifers were maintained. And the plot at the bottom just shows some of the details of this analysis, where we're plotting. The blue bars are showing the average monthly precipitation for the years 2003 to 2017. And the red line shows the groundwater recharge volume by month simulated for existing conditions, and the green line for future conditions. And what it shows us is that on an average annual condition, the volume of recharge is the same or higher under future conditions, owing to some of those stormwater management methods. But also we do see an increase in recharge, a slight increase in the summer, but largely the frequency and seasonal variation is maintained. And that's everything I had.
So apologies to the audience and Rebecca. We're at 9 minutes over our presentation. So going to try and go very rapidly here and take something in 6 minutes and about a minute. So next
you know what, Ron,
slide.
can I just interrupt you for a second? I just wanted to reassure you, we don't have that many questions in the chat, so I think you can catch your breath. And if you need to take 5 or 6 minutes to do this, I don't want to end late, but I don't think we have a lot of questions that have to be discussed in this forum. We'll make sure to do that on Have Your Say. So catch your breath and give us what you got.
Very good.
Important we hear from you.
Okay, apologies again. Next slide. So surface water basically builds from the earlier analysis. You've seen the different headwater catchments that we're dealing with. And the whole role is to identify where the water's moving and what it's feeding, and then ultimately develop the master plan from that for stormwater. Next slide. So considerable monitoring, much like Margot alluded to in terms of natural systems, as well as Darren alluded to in terms of the groundwater. We were dealing with surface water quantity and quality across the study area. Next slide. Here you have just the movement of water. This is the overland component, and it compares well, but not exactly with the geometry of the movement of water that Darren said. So there's not sort of a perfect correlation between groundwater and surface water, but it's quite informative. Next slide. So here's an overlay of the natural heritage system as outlined by Margot with all the depressional features. And as you can see, it's quite pockmarked, and there are many that are within the natural heritage system, but there's many important ones that are outside. And those noted with stars, red stars, are the more significant and the major ones that really basically receive everything. They have no overflow. And these are the ones that are very important, particularly within the white non-natural heritage system for retention and consideration in developing the plan going forward. Next slide. So much like the groundwater, there is an analytical model produced that looked at the movement of water across the landscape, and then using different standards that was used to develop the quantum in terms of developing the designs for the stormwater management system. Next slide. Next slide. So here is the overlay then without the natural heritage system, showing all the different individual catchments. So catchments are all the little areas that drain to the hummocky topography. And this needed to be considered first off in the existing conditions that established our targets. So the objective being that we really end up with no net impact and dovetail with the groundwater management to ultimately have a solid plan that doesn't adversely affect the natural features. Next slide. So the stormwater management plan really is building then looking at the proposed land use conditions, and then those targets that we indicated were set earlier in the environmental impact study, building from Margot's understanding and Darren's understanding, and then working towards the overall management perspective. Next slide. So a number of different alternatives were assessed under the guise of the class environmental assessment process. And this reviews various different management classes that then need to be evaluated in greater detail at the next stages of planning and design. Next slide. So the criteria, basically we're dealing with the social, natural, and ecological and economic conditions, and looking at the effectiveness of the alternatives to meet the end objectives and address the impacts. Next slide. And in terms of the classes, end of pipe, these are your traditional ponds that you would see at the end or the lower part of a development area. The more innovative source control, so the low impact development practices that really treat the water before it gets into the system, and then combinations of those, and then also consideration for climate change. Next slide. So the preferred community structure was then evaluated in the context of the amount of runoff, both peak flows and volumes, and then the contaminants, and then obviously the water budget, which Darren has gone through. Next slide. So the ultimate plan then ended up with a combination of looking at source controls, and these source controls would be constructed on both the public realm, which is the right-of-ways, road right-of-ways, as well as the private land. So there would be a responsibility of the landowners who reside within Clare Maltby to also contribute to the management of water. And that's because it's distributed, and the distributed actually works much better and more effective in serving the water budget. And then these overall surface water capture areas where we're looking at the balance. So any storms greater than 20 millimeters, which is kind of like an annual storm, they would then run off and proceed to these capture areas that have been cited based upon the information around the characterization of the sensitivity of the areas. And here we're looking at the regional storm, which is the largest criteria, and there would need to be some provision for overflow to any existing depressions. Next slide. And then really what we're dealing with here is the need to have a treatment train, so looking at multiple barriers to ultimately manage the water and protect any sort of impacts to groundwater as well. Next slide. And then here is just showing a plan of the future land use and the different drainage capture areas and where the water is going. And you can see kind of the blue areas being cited as the stormwater capture areas. Next slide. And this provides a greater detail then with the resolution of the actual explicit land use and various refinements going forward. And another component being the co-location of parks in and around where the surface water capture areas are in schools. Next slide. So the results, much like Darren's documented, we've been able to meet the flow targets at the main receivers, the Hanlon and the Mill, and the water budget has been validated both by the surface water and groundwater modeling, and ultimately stormwater management would be phased as development occurs. Next slide. Thank you very much. And apologies for the fast talking there at the end.
I can't get anybody in trouble for fast talking, Ron. That is my, every report card I ever received did mention that in every presentation I've ever given. So I'm right there with you. Thanks so much. Folks, we do want to honor your time though, and it is time for us to finish this session. So if you do need to go, please do. We want to remind you though that Have Your Say Guelph, all of the questions asked today will be finding their way there. We are going to take a last few minutes though to answer a couple of the questions that have been mentioned in the chat. So if you're able to stay, please do. But if not, just know that you'll be able to find them there. Our next sessions tonight are at 6:30. That's an overview of the draft secondary plan, followed by a conversation about land use and parks, and then mobility at 8 o'clock tonight. So let me just, a couple questions around access to property and around tree removal have already been answered in the chat, but there are a couple that I want to bring to the panel's attention, if you don't mind, please. So we have three. One was, would the consulting team be able to identify how the kettle ponds in the area function in the headland areas? Margot, is that, I don't know who that is exactly, but can someone speak to how the kettle ponds function?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe Darren would be best for that one. I don't know, Darren, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think I noticed that that question came up just before I was presenting, so I'm not sure if maybe that was addressed. But many of those ponds were looked at in detail, and that's where a lot of our shallow monitoring locations were installed. So we have multiple years of data to understand that. But what we do see is for a lot of those ponds, not Hall's Pond though, they are perched above the regional groundwater table, so they tend to receive runoff, most of it in the spring, that maintains that pond level. And that pond level may change due to evaporation, but there is also a component of leakage from the base of those that does help to recharge the system. So most of them are not groundwater fed, but almost the opposite. They do provide that function of recharging the groundwater.
Thanks for that. We have another groundwater question. Actually, all three of the questions might be for you. I'm not sure, Darren. One of them says, in terms of groundwater modeling, were anticipated changes by climate change factored in at all?
Yeah, I think there's maybe two parts to that, and Ron might be able to talk to the stormwater design part of it, but certainly when we were simulating future conditions, we used the historical record. So we used a monthly precipitation from the existing historical record. So almost 15 years, I think, in the one simulation. And that provided a range of both wet and dry years. So it gave us some understanding of the variability, and also included some multiple wet years and multiple dry years. But also within the stormwater management pieces, some of that resiliency is built in there to account for climate change. I don't know if Ron wants to speak to that in more detail.
Sure, yeah, it's a little bit different for the surface water component, because what we've been able to do, there's the receiving systems, so these surface water capture areas, they are actually designed to a hurricane standard, which really doesn't have a normal conventional climate change component to it, meaning that it's a fair bit larger than what would normally be for a 100-year system. However, getting the water to these facilities needs to have consideration of climate change. So we've looked at the influence on the sizing of overland flow systems as well as subsurface systems to get the water there. So there has been that consideration for resiliency planning. As well, the low impact development measures provide a further level of resiliency in this development for climate change mitigation.
Thanks very much for that clarification. We have one more question, and it says, since all runoff is to be infiltrated to protect groundwater from salt pollution, will all paved areas, including roads and parking areas, be required to use porous pavement since porous pavement requires less salt application?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we actually, as part of the MESP, conducted an extensive review of salt management practices basically around the globe. And I think as most folks on the call are aware, salt is a pretty insidious type of contaminant, and that it's very difficult to remove from suspension. So we've indicated a whole series of best practices for the municipality to consider, with obviously the number one best practice is reducing the use of salt. But there are multi-tiered and multi-level approaches to salt management that are detailed within the plan, and porous pavement is actually one of those, because there is more friction and then less need for salt. So good point, and it has already been addressed, and there will be consideration in the planning going forward.
Terrific. Thanks, Ron. And thanks to everyone for your questions. As I mentioned, all of the questions and any others that you post there will be answered on Have Your Say Guelph. And you're welcome to engage in the virtual town hall that you'll find there, that's going to be posted right from now until the 8th of August. We also will have virtual office hours posted, as well as some smaller group targeted conversations with particular audiences. And so if you want to engage in other ways, please let us know. And the team would be happy to set up a way for you to have your more specific questions answered. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And please do note that if you're interested in hearing more about the project, an overview will be provided at 6:30 tonight, followed by a conversation about land use and parks policy. So that piece of the conversation today will happen from 6:30 to 7:45. If you attended the earlier overview at 1 o'clock, it'll be repeat content for roughly the first 40 minutes or so. And so you're welcome to join us just after 7 if you'd like to hear just the land use and parks part. And then at 8 o'clock for 45 minutes, we'll have a conversation about the mobility pieces of the draft secondary plan. So have a good break, enjoy your evening. And if you're able to join us at 6:30, we'll look forward to seeing you there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.